So let's do a little bit of review and talk about what we have done so far in our notes on section 1.4, which involves solving what kind of equations? Do you remember what they're called? Quadratic. Awesome. So let's do this. We will try a few problems. What if I give you, let's do this. See if you can solve. And the first one is okay, so let's solve x squared minus 4x equals 21. How are we going to start that?
Keep it 0. Subtract 1.
Excellent. He said you need to subtract 21 to set this equal to 0. That's the first thing, right? So if I subtract 21 from each side, and y'all put this on paper, do it with me, okay? The more you write it down, the more likely you are to remember it. Okay, so that was the first step. If I've got a quadratic equation, I want to get everything on one side, set it equal to 0 when it's an ax squared plus bx plus c, okay? Now, what method do you think would be good to try with this? I'll give you a hint, think of the F word. Factoring. Okay, yeah, I gotta think of the right F word. All right, so we're going to try to factor. Now, if I'm going to try to factor, that's the AC method. So what would I do first? A times C, which is going to be what? 1 times negative 21, which equals a negative 21. Okay, does that tell me anything that will help me come up with the right pair of numbers I'm going to need? What do I know about signs? They're going to be different because if my pair of numbers has to multiply to give me negative 21, the only way I multiply two numbers and get a negative is if one is negative and one is positive. Correct? Okay, what else do I need to pay attention to? Besides A times C, I also want to look at what B equals. And B equals what? Negative 4. Okay, now I can start thinking about numbers. Is there a pair that would multiply to give me negative 21 but add to give me negative 4? All right, the only things that will multiply to give me 21 are 1 and 21 and 7 and 3. Now I just have to decide, since you guys said you think 7 and 3 is the right pair, which number should be negative, 7 or 3? Why would I want the 7 to be negative and the 3 to be positive? Because if I put the 3 as negative and the 7 is positive, I get a positive 4 when I add them. If I need to get a negative 4, that means the larger number needs to be negative. So when I add these two together, I get negative 4. Now, give me a quick signal. How many of you are saying, I'm with you, this so far is good, I got this. Okay, where do we go from here? Would anybody want to come finish the problem? I'm giving you an opportunity if you want to write on the board. Derek, you want to do it? We'll help you if you get stuck. Keith. All right, come on up. Good.
All right, so
Move this chair out of the way.
equals 21.
Well, we're recopying this, so you got your minus 21 equals 0. Good job. Okay, so far so good. He replaced negative 4x with a negative 7x plus 3x. Okay, can you tell us what that step is? What did you do here?
Factor
And you were factoring how many terms?
2.
Just the first 2 terms. So he said that the common factor with x squared minus 7x was x. Very good. Now what would you write down next?
And then you write down plus
Uh-huh.
and 3 x.
Okay, so he said in the second pair of terms that 3 was the common factor. So he wrote that down and then put x minus 7 in parentheses. Is there anything we need to put after that? Equals 0. Good. We don't want to lose our equation. Okay, so step to the side just a little bit. Make sure everybody can see it. Does that make sense? Okay, so now, do you know how to get this thing factored completely? He's almost there. What does he need to write next? Good. The 2 parentheses, and then you're going to show us what goes inside. And then don't forget your equals 0, right? Okay, so he's done all the factoring now, and it's time to use what's called the 0 factor property. So we're not done until we get x equals. And the reason we can get x equals is because this was an equation. If there's no equals in the original problem, all you could do is factor, you can't solve. But we're going to be able to solve. So see if you can come up with the possible values x can be that would make this true.
It should be 2, right?
There's going to be 2 different x values that would work.
So x equals -3 and x equals 7.
Okay. Great job. Thank you for coming up. So can somebody tell me where his x equals -3 came from? Let's make sure this part makes sense. When he got this factored, he said this parentheses times this parentheses equals 0. The only way you can multiply 2 things together and get 0 is if what?
I mean,
The only way you multiply 2 things together and get 0 is if
multiply by 0.
one of the numbers is 0, right? So what he really did was he said x plus 3 equals 0. He set the first parentheses equal to 0, and then he set the second parentheses equal to 0. And when he solved it, that's how he came up with x equals -3 and x equals +7. Okay? What do you think? We got factoring, solving by using the 0 factor property.
So that x squared, I mean, you just write it down twice. No?
Well, the x squared is what tells us that we will end up with 2 possible values for x, potentially. Sometimes it could be the same number. Like we might come up with x equals 2 and x equals 2, that there's the same number comes up in both parentheses. And if that happens, that's okay. But it means that we potentially get 2 different numbers for x. Most of the time we will. All right. Okay, we'll give it that. Then let's look at something else that we did last class and see if we could solve this. So let's say we were going to solve maybe something like this. X squared minus 32 equals 0. Okay, x squared minus 32 equals 0. Is this something we could solve by factoring? What do you guys think? Okay, so he thinks maybe we could solve by factoring. The only thing I'm kind of looking at with this, remember with factoring, when there's 2 terms, we said, first of all, you check for a common factor. Do we have one? No. And so then when we see there's only 2 terms, what we check for to see if it would factor is this first term a perfect square? What would you say? Yes. Remember, we have 3 questions we're asking. Is the last term a perfect square? That's a no. If I get a no, can I factor it? No. So I can't really solve this one by factoring because I got a no when I check on that second question. But I do know of another method I could use when it looks like this. Do you remember what it's called? The square root property. And it only is good to use if b equals 0, right? And does b equal 0 here? Because remember, this is standard form of a quadratic equation. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if I don't see a plain x, a term that just has x to the first in it, then that means b was equal to 0. And I can solve this for x squared by doing what? What would you do first? Good. This is the one time you don't leave it equals to 0. You're going to add 32 to both sides. Right? Okay. So now if x squared equals 32, what would I do next? All right. I need to get rid of the square because I don't really care what x squared equals. I want to know what x equals. So to make the square go away, I'm going to take the square root. Now, have I written this correctly? This is the tricky part. Well, it is going to need to be simple. There you go. If I'm putting the square root into the problem, I have to remember there's both a positive and a negative root. So I have to put a plus or minus in front of that square root sign. Okay? And that means the square root of x squared is just x. But Patrick is right. He said we got to simplify this radical on the right. I know it's not a perfect square, but I want to see if there's anything I might be able to pull out. So how do I figure out if I can simplify the square root of 32? I have to do what? Say it again? Yeah, I'm going to use prime factorization. Good. So what would be the first prime factor I divide into 32? 2. Goes how many times? 16. Keep going. 2 goes again. How many times? 8. Still even? 2 goes. Do I stop? Keep going. 2 goes 2 times. Now, what do I do next? I got to circle up pairs, right? So when I circle this pair and this pair, you said it's going to be what? 4 that, does it stay under the square root or come out? Good. Anything I've circled gets to come out. I take 1 from each circle and multiply it. So I get plus or minus 4. What else? Square root of 2. The 1, 2 I didn't circle has to stay under the radical. At this point, would I be done? Yes, I am. Good job. What would have been the only thing different if this had started off as a plus 32, and that meant when I subtract 32 from each side, this had been a negative? That would mean everything would be the same except because the negative's under the radical and I would come out, right? So you want to watch for that. If you have a negative under the square root sign, be sure you pull your eye out. Phones away, please. Okay, so do you remember where we stopped last time? We were learning the third type of quadratic method for solving quadratic equations. What's it called? The quadratic equation formula. So let's go to the page where we were and let's review quickly what we did, and then we're going to do another problem. Okay, so this is the quadratic equation formula. How do we remember it? That's right. You got a little D. You're going to sing. Da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da. Come on. Negative b. Say it with me. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Come on, sing along. Negative b. Plus or minus, there you go, the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Snap, snap. All right. So that's what we have to know, because if you don't write this down correctly, there's no way you're going to come up with the right answer. What do I have to be careful that I do before I identify my A, my B, and my C? Well, it's always a good idea to see if you could factor, but as long as I have all three terms, b is not 0, then I want to move everything to one side and set it equal to 0 first before you identify A, B, and C. If I start here and I say C is 3, will I get this thing right? No, I won't. C is actually -3 because I have to set it equal to 0 before I start, okay? So let's try example 6. So you've got your notes packet out from chapter 1, right? And let's see if we can do this using the quadratic formula. Now, what do you think we're going to need to do first? It says 4x squared equals 3x minus 5. Okay, so Patrick is saying we got to get everything on one side and set it equal to 0, right? And since we usually like to keep the x squared term positive, we like for a to be a positive. If we were going to factor, we want a to be positive. Let's move these two terms over to the left side. And the way we do that is we're going to subtract 3x from both sides. And then we're going to add 5 to both sides. Is it okay if I do that at the same time? Does that make sense? So I know everything canceled out on the right. I've got an equal 0 on the right. Now tell me what I have on the left.
X squared.
Is it just x squared or 4x squared? Minus 3x plus 5. Okay, so far so good, right? Now, if I wanted to try to factor, it's telling us we're going to use the quadratic formula, but let's just check and see if this thing would have factored. How would I test it? I would need to do what to figure out if this could factor? Start with A times C. So tell me what's A and what is C? Okay, A is 4. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and write this down. A equals 4. What's B? -3. What's C? Positive 5. So if I do A times C, that's 4 times 5, which is 20, which tells me, what about my signs? They're the same. They're either both positive or both negative. Since B is -3, what does that tell me? Both signs would have to be what? Negative. So here's the question. Is there a pair of numbers you could multiply? You get positive 20 when you multiply, but you add those numbers together and you get a -3. That is not going to happen, is it? Because if they're both negative, and we're going to come up with 20, my only options would be 1 and 20. Add -1, -20, you don't get -3. 2 and 10, 4 and 5, there's no way that's going to happen. So that's how I know this thing is not factorable. Okay? It's not factorable, which means we have to have another method, and that's why we're going to use quadratic formula. Da 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 da. 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 Say it with me. -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Snap, snap. Okay, really important that you write the formula down before you try to plug in. We good so far? Yes, ma'am. You don't have a chapter 1 packet? Because we started on it a while back. See if you have, I think I've given all of them out. So I know what A, B, and C are equal to. I know what the quadratic equation formula is. So now it's time to plug in. Now, before I plug in, what's the smart thing for me to put on my paper? Excellent. I'm going to replace each variable with a parentheses because that's going to help me avoid making some sign mistakes. All right, now it's time to plug in what goes in the parentheses. So since that's a negative, and this is supposed to be B, what goes in for B?
3.
-3. And this is where if you don't put the parentheses, you're going to mess up because you're going to see the negative sign there and you're going to think it's already there. And you'll put -3. But what's going to happen in a minute when I clean up a -3? It's going to turn into +3. So -3 goes here because that's B squared minus 4A. A is 4. C is what? 5. And then 2A on the bottom, A is 4. So far, we okay? All right, tell me where you would start on your cleanup. Under the radical, excellent. So I need to figure out what this number is going to be. What happens if I square -3? I'm going to get 9. And then I have minus 4 times 4 times 5. What is 4 times 4? 16 times 5 is how much?
300.
Let's do it this way. What's 5 times 4? And what's 20 times -4? Yeah, so we're going to have 9 minus 80, right? Okay, how much is 9 minus 80? Negative what? Negative 71. So X is going to equal, tell me what to write down, because I'm cleaning that down.
So negative X equals 3. But what if that's not?
Okay, so X equals 3. We've got the plus or minus. And what we're going to put under the radical is what we get over here when we clean this up. Squaring -3 gave us 9. And then we have our subtraction sign. And 4 times 4 times 5 is 80. And you said 9 minus 80 is negative 71. And all of this is over what number? 8. 2 times 4 is 8. Is that my final answer? What else needs to happen? Bring your I out. Pull the I out because there's a negative under the square root. So this is going to equal 3 plus or minus, what do I write now? I square root of 71 over 8. And then you ask yourself, could the square root of 71 simplify? And the answer is no, because it's time. If I check, it's not even. I know 2 doesn't go into it. 3 won't go into it because how much is 7 plus 1? 8. 3 doesn't go into 8 evenly, so 3 won't go into 71 evenly. Since it's not even, I don't have to worry about any other even numbers. So 2 won't go, 3 won't go. 5, would 5 divide into this evenly? No, because if it did, it would have to end in what? 5 or 0. That doesn't happen. I could try 71 divided by 7, and I would find that doesn't go. And at that point, you're pretty sure you've got a prime number here, okay? So this is your cleaned up answer. Does that make sense? So if we end up, it's possible we can end up with a negative sign underneath that radical, correct? Because that just happened. If it does, make sure you pull your I out, and then if the radical simplifies, you want to do that. If it doesn't simplify, you stop, because that's what we just did. Questions so far? All right, let's scroll to this. And we're just going to go through this quickly. You know, I told you that part that's underneath the square root has a special name. It's called the discriminant. All right. What goes underneath the square root sign? We got negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. That's the part that's the discriminant. I'm just interested in knowing what that number is going to be under the square root, because it's going to tell me a little something about the type of answer I'm going to get. We just saw sometimes I get a positive number under the square root. That gives me one kind of answer. If there's a negative number under the square root, what does that mean is going to happen? You're going to have an I in it. So that's different kinds of answers. So, and that would be helpful for us to know, because we're going to kind of build on this and talk about what that's going to tell us as we go through the rest of the course. Now, it's possible that the number underneath the radical is positive in a perfect square. An example of that might be the square root of 25. Okay? That's an example. It's positive and it's a perfect square. Now, if I end up with something and there's a plus or minus square root of 25, when I clean that up, will there still be a square root sign there? No, it's going to be something plus or minus 5, and then it's divided by whatever's in the denominator. But if there's no radical there, and the number is not 0, I've got something plus 5 divided by blah, 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 and something minus 5 divided by whatever's on bottom. How many solutions is that? 2. If there's a plus or minus, and what comes after it is not 0, I'm going to have 2 solutions. And if there's no radical anymore, what kind of number would that be?
Positive.
Maybe it would turn out to be something like 3/2 and -1/2. That might be an example of what you'd see. What kind of numbers are those called? Excellent. They are rational. So we get 2 rational solutions, means there's no square root in it, when we have a positive perfect square underneath the radical. When b squared minus 4ac is a positive perfect square. Okay? Now, it's also possible that the number we get is positive, but it's not a perfect square. Maybe something like the square root of 32. We just did that guy a minute ago. If we have something like the square root of 32, am I going to have how many solutions? I've got something plus or minus the square root of 32. I still get 2 solutions because there is a number that's not 0 after the plus or minus sign. But now, will my square root still be in my answer?
Yes.
Because if that's not a perfect square, I may get some stuff to come out from under the radical, but it won't all. There's still going to be a radical. And if there's still a radical there, what kind of solution would it be? It's not rational because there's a radical, so it's going to be irrational. Excellent. I'm checking to see if you remember some of those words. Okay, so you're going to fill this in because you can go back and review it if you need to. And irrational simply means we still have a square root in the answer. Okay? Now, that's all the possibility for positive numbers, right? It's either a positive perfect square or it's positive but it's not a perfect square. So the other options are, it might be when we do b squared minus 4ac, we get 0. So that means if I've got the square root of 0, what is the square root of 0? Yeah, it's equal to 0. So I get some number plus 0 and some number minus 0. How many answers is that? Because if I add 0 to something, it doesn't change it. If I subtract 0 from something, it doesn't change it. You're exactly right. There's only one solution. Okay? And that one solution, will it have a square root in it? If it doesn't have a square root in it, then what kind of solution is it? It's rational. Yeah, it is a real number, but to be more specific, it's rational because there's no square root in it. Okay? So we've covered all the possibilities except for which one? Yeah, if the b squared minus 4ac is negative. So if you ended up with something like we just did, and you get a -71. Now, that means I've got in the quadratic formula something plus or minus the square root of -71. How many solutions will I have? I still have 2, right? Because the square root of -71 is not 0. If it's any number that's not 0, then I'm still going to get 2 solutions because I've got to take whatever's in front of it plus this and whatever's in front of it minus that. That's going to give me 2 solutions, but what kind are these?
Complex.
Complex. Very good. And it's specifically, it's non-real complex because it means there's an I in it. Okay? So if you wanted to put in our non-real complex, that's more specific than just saying complex. Okay. So just by looking at what shows up under the radical, it's going to tell us something about how many solutions we're going to have and what it's going to be like. And as we move through the course, we're going to come back to this and we're going to talk about what this might mean in terms of if I were looking at a graph, how would that show up in the graph? We won't go there today. I'm just telling you, we'll come back and revisit this a little bit later. So now, all it's asking you to do, does it say solve this using the quadratic equation formula? No, what does it tell you to do? Just use the discriminant. We want to find out what that number is, and then you're going to look at that number and you're going to be able to tell me how many solutions and what kind of solutions they are. So let's do this one together, okay? What did we say is the discriminant? What's the formula for that part? B squared minus 4AC, right? Okay, so look at this and can you tell me what is A?
4.
So A is 4. What's B? B is negative 12. What's C? Positive 9. Do I have to be sure this thing equals 0 before I identify A, B, and C? Yes, I do. And it was already equal to 0, so we're good. So if I put parentheses for each of these variables, and then inside I plug in the values, what goes in for B? Negative 12. My A is 4. My C is 9. Okay. You guys clean that up. You're going to tell me what value this is. When you think you know, I want you to raise your hand. Got one. On the count of 3, I want you to hold up your fingers and show me, since in here we know, excuse me, we either get 2 solutions or 1 solution. On the count of 3, I want you to hold up one hand to show me, do you think there are 2 solutions or 1 solution on this problem? 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's not 100% of 1, but I do see more people holding up 1 finger than 2. So let's figure out if you 1-fingered people are correct. What happens when you square negative 12? What do you get?
144.
If you put it in your calculator and you didn't put negative 12 in parentheses, it told you a negative 144, and that's going to mess you up. This is actually a positive 144. Minus, how much was 4 times 4 times 9? 144. 144 minus 144 equals what number?
0.
My discriminant is 0, and that means I have how many solutions? 1, and what kind of solution is it? Rational. Good. 1 rational solution. Now, we're going to have a little competition here. Ladies, I'm going to give you B, and I want y'all to see if you can come up with the answer on B. Gentlemen, you're going to work on C, and we're going to see if y'all can powwow with each other. After you get it, we'll see if everybody gets it right. Okay, so Taylor's going to show us what she did on B. And then ladies, y'all check to see that you got the same thing. Gentlemen, you pay attention to see if you think that you would get the same thing, or you can try to work it with her. So first thing Taylor's doing is she's trying to tell us what A, B, and C are equal to. Okay, now move over to the side for a second. You guys tell us if that looks right. What is the first thing that we need to make sure we do? We need to make sure it's equal to 0. So can you set that equation equal to 0, and then let's check and be sure we've got the right signs on A, B, and C. Well, yeah, the 3x squared plus x just stays the same. And then to set it equal to 0, what do we have to do?
With the minus, like plus.
you're gonna actually add 5, aren't you, to both sides? Yeah,
Yeah.
and then when you add 5 on that side, that's gonna make it equal 0. Good. Now go back and check. Are all your signs right on A, B, and C?
No, not this
C needs to be positive. Okay, there you go. Now, what are you gonna plug that into?
one. The b squared minus 4.
Yes, b squared minus 4ac. So let's write that down.
Do I just put 1 or x? Just do x or 1? I put 1, but it's like the same thing.
Well, yeah, I would say first write down b squared minus 4ac, and then we'll put the parentheses, okay? And then you can put the numbers inside.
It's hard to write.
I know it feels kind of funny writing with just your finger.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's put parentheses for all those variables are, and then you can plug in your numbers. Mhm. Okay, so what goes in for B? Y'all help her out. 1. And what goes in for A? 3. And what goes in for C? 5. Okay, so now what do you get when you clean that up? 1 minus 60, which equals,
What you said?
yeah, you got the right
Okay.
answer on your paper, negative 59. Okay, that number is called the what?
The negative.
The
Discriminant.
discriminant. Good, and it is negative. So what does that tell you about how many solutions and what kind, Taylor?
It has 2 solutions and it's non-real complex.
So very good. She said 2 non-real complex solutions. Good job. Okay, does that make sense? All right. Gentlemen, who would like to come to the board and show us how to do C? Any volunteers? You left? Okay. Quay, do you want to? Or Tavish? One of you guys? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Tate. I'm sorry, Tate. You want to come? Bryce? No? Oh, my, you're all being, okay, how about you, Cardi? Okay, so Jakarian moved everything to one side. Can you also put the equal 0 up there for me? Yeah, thanks. So we keep the equation. And he's just going straight to the parentheses and he's plugging in the values. If you're real confident, you know what you're doing, you can do that. But it's always good to write down the b squared minus 4ac just in case you make a mistake. And I can tell, yeah, you did know what you were supposed to plug it into. You just kind of put in the wrong numbers. So let's see, do y'all agree with how he's put this in? He said b was negative 6, a was 2, c was negative 7. Does that look right?
Are you wrong?
Okay, so y'all help him out. He said negative 6 squared is positive 36. We agree on that? Yes, because that negative 6 is in parentheses. But look at the next number. He's got 36 minus negative 56. Can that be cleaned up? What would that be the same thing as? 36 minus the negative becomes plus a positive. Because remember, we can add the opposite. So it's 36 plus positive 56, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so you tell us what that's going to be when we add those together. Yeah, now if you make that a plus sign, make sure you turn the negative sign into a positive as well. So it turns minus a negative into plus a positive. Now, if you get a positive 92 for the, what's that called? What part? The discriminant. What does that tell you about how many solutions and what kind? 2, and what kind will they be?
Irrational.
Good, 2 irrational. Good job. Okay, so we have finished all the notes now that go with section 1.4. And let me tell you what's in section 1.5, all right? It's more of the same, except now they're word problems. Okay, are you excited? All right, so hold on a second.